Tonight's journey doesn't lead through the ruins of empires or the fields of ancient battles. Instead, we take a slower, stranger path through monastic halls and plague-ridden villages. Through candlelit cells and smoky alehouses, we will explore the many ways medieval people, saw-tanned, often stumbled into altered states of consciousness. They did it on purpose, by accident, sometimes while praying, sometimes while dying, and almost always without the faintest idea of the chemical mechanisms at work. Before we sip the ale, chew the bread, or smell the strange resins, do me one small favor. Let me know where you are in the world and what time it is there as you listen. It's a lovely thing, this invisible congregation from across the globe. If you'd like to support the show and get more of these sleep-friendly historical journeys, you can find the Patreon link in the description. For now, lie back, get comfortable. Let's begin. Daily life in the Middle Ages was not romantic. It was not all illuminated manuscripts and reverent prayer. More often, it was cold feet, infected teeth, bad stew, and a constant, grinding anxiety about sin. Most people owned nothing. Most could not read. Most lived in a state of persistent pain. A broken bone could mean a permanent limp. The loss of a child was met with a quiet burial and a return to back-breaking labor. If your neighbor claimed to see a demon in the rafters, you did not laugh, because sometimes they did appear. No one wanted to be the one who doubted. It is no surprise, then, that people turned to other things, to herbs and brews, powders and fumes, to roots dug from graveyards, or flowers picked under a full moon. Sometimes it was medicine. Sometimes it was ritual. Sometimes it was just to feel something different. A little relief, a little distance, a little magic, even if it only lasted an hour. They did not call it addiction. The concept did not exist. They did not call it sin unless the priest did. They just knew that after the drink, or the smoke, or the root, the air felt lighter. Their thoughts grew less sharp, and the pain, wherever it lived in the body, went quiet. We begin where everyone did, at the bottom of a mug. In the medieval world, being mildly intoxicated wasn't just acceptable, it was almost mandatory. This wasn't about festive revelry, but a quiet, routine necessity born from the fact that beer was often the only safe thing to drink. Water was a gamble, wells stagnated, rivers were fouled by livestock and waste. Beer, on the other hand, was boiled and fermented. It was slightly alcoholic, and therefore safeish. What passed for beer was often thick, flat, warm, and suspicious. It tasted of grain sacks, sometimes with bits of grain still floating in it, but it filled the stomach and didn't rot your insides. Unlike wine, you didn't need a vineyard or a patron to make it. You just needed barley, water, and a high tolerance for disappointment. Everyone drank it. Children were given small ale, a weak, watered-down broth. It wasn't indulgence, it was survival. Infants sipped it with porridge. Toddlers slurped it at midday. Milk soured. Water killed. Beer was as consistent as a muddy grave for working adults. The beer was stronger, not enough to knock you over, but enough to make the day's labor slightly less unbearable. Peasants drank before heading to the fields. Stonecutters drank before lifting heavy stones. Fishermen drank before facing the cold sea. The drink didn't improve the work, but it made the complaining about it more rhythmic. Monasteries elevated the process. Benedictine monks, in particular, took brewing seriously, operating on the assumption that God like everyone else, appreciated a decent pint. Their recipes were refined, documented, and debated. The result was a smoother, darker, stronger ale. This wasn't vice, it was holiness. During Lent, solid food was forbidden, but liquid was not. A theological loophole was discovered. If you made your beer thick enough, it could qualify as a mila liquid bread. In some cloisters, monks consumed up to 3 gallons of this strong ale a day. They stumbled slightly during Vespers, their chanting slowed. A novice might try to light a candle that was already burning. No one spoke of it directly. They simply gave thanks and quietly refilled the tankard. The nobility drank for entirely different reasons, most of them theatrical. At court, wine was preferred imported, perfumed, and stored in cellars deeper than some moats, but beer and mead flowed freely as well. Drinking was a performance, complete with rituals of toasting, competitive gulping, and the occasional spontaneous duel. Feasts began with order and rarely ended that way. It was not uncommon to see a minor lord slumped into a plate of roast pigeon, or a knight attempting to joust a tapestry. Slurred poetry was recited. Marriage proposals were made, retracted, and made again. The church frowned, but not too hard. Everyone involved was a teether. A peasant passed out in the mud was a warning. A baron passed out on a velvet cushion was simply tradition. At the heart of it all was the alehouse. Every village had one, even if it was just a lean-to with a fire and a barrel. It was a social balm, a place where grievances softened and gossip fermented. People gathered after long days of repetitive agony to drink slightly less awful beer and hear slightly worse versions of familiar stories. Laughter was rare, but it was real. Beer was also a primitive anesthetic. Midwives offered it to laboring women. Barbers poured it into patients with broken limbs. There was no standard dosage. The patient drank until they stopped caring. In this world, sobriety was not a virtue. It was a health risk. To be stone-cold sober was to be fully present in a body that hurt under laws that despised you, facing a future with more plowing than payoff. Alcohol dulled that sharp knowledge. It didn't solve anything, but it slowed the dread, and that was worth something. The church was aware of all this. It preached moderation, condemned excess, and then promptly returned to the cloister where the beer was thick enough to hold a spoon upright. Monks knew better than most how hard it was to feel close to God while fully conscious. Drunken chanting might not be dignified, but it was often more honest. Piety and pints went hand in hand, provided the pint was locally brewed and the priest hadn't recently had to drag you from a drainage ditch. Of course, the drink was not always safe. Bad batches happened. Improper fermentation, moldy grain, or accidental additions of poisonous herbs could lead to ale that caused blindness, paralysis, or spontaneous public singing. Still, people kept drinking because water was worse, because sobriety was worse, because beer, however unpredictable, was familiar. And so the world drifted forward in a haze of barley and resignation. Peasants raised their mugs before lifting the plow. Nobles fell asleep, mint toast. Monks swayed in candlelight, full of theological loopholes and warm grain. The liquid varied, but the logic did not. Drink to dull the ache, to mark the feast, to survive the fast. Drink because it was the only thing anyone could afford to believe in. Of course, not every altered state was welcomed or intended. Bad harvest year-end there were many bread became a gamble. Grain was scarce, storage was poor, and desperation was high. People baked what they had, and what they had wasn't always safe. Rye, the bread of the poor, stored moisture a little too well. In that moisture and darkness, something else grew: ergot, a fungus. To the naked eye, infected rye looked a bit off, darker, misshapen, perhaps slightly musty, but that was hardly alarming in a world where everything already smelled of mildew and wet straw. People ground it, baked it, and ate it. The alternative was hunger, and hunger was an accomplice to death. The fungus didn't announce itself right away. The first symptoms were subtle: a tingling in the fingertips, a numb patch on the foot, a strange sensation behind the eyes. Then came the cramps, the twitching, the limbs that began to jerk like a puppet's. Soon the screaming began. Some collapsed, unable to control their bodies. Others began to see things utterly divorced from reality. Angels descended in golden flame. Demons clawed through the thatch. Dead relatives appeared to deliver cryptic, unhelpful messages. Entire villages resembled poorly organized exorcisms. The symptoms split into two grim categories. In one, the afflicted hallucinated with the clarity of a stained glass fever dream. They shouted prophecies, stripped naked in the square, and danced until their legs gave out. This form was oddly less fatal. The other type was quieter and crueler. It began in the extremities. Blood vessels constricted, skin turned pale, then blue, then black. Fingers, toes, noses, and ears rotted while still attached. The pain was immense until it wasn't. By then, gangrene had set in, and it was too late. No one knew what caused it, but the pattern was familiar: a wet harvest, strange bread, and then a sudden wave of villagers writhing in agony or preaching from rooftops. No one trusted the grain, but no one could afford to throw it away. The church responded with prayer, relics, and relocation. Pilgrimage hospitals, especially those dedicated to St. Anthony, became the destination for the afflicted. St. Anthony's fire became the polite term. It sounded better than hallucinatory flesh rot. Outbreaks became part of seasonal folklore. In one notable incident in 934, an outbreak was said to have killed 40,000 people in Aquitaine. In another, an entire convent collapsed into collective vision. The nuns experiencing raptures, speaking in tongues, and displaying an alarming enthusiasm for levitation. It took 3 priests and a confused doctor to convince them to stop. The hallucinations were remembered long after the pain faded. A man claimed to have spoken to Saint Michael in a barley field. A woman described an angel with too many eyes who told her to become a potter. These stories were added to the pile of things no one understood but dared not ignore. For those who survived, there was often a social cost. People would nod but not invite you in. Some villages began to pray over their loaves before baking or store grain in different barns. These measures were unlikely to help, but they felt like control. And control was the rarest commodity of all. It would take centuries before anyone looked through a microscope and saw the culprit. A fungus curled around a rye kernel like a secret. Until then, people kept eating, kept twitching, kept seeing things they were never meant to see. And somewhere in the midst of it, someone would always proclaim it a miracle. Sometimes the poison was a mistake. Other times it was an invitation away from the courts and cloisters. In the quiet corners of the medieval world, folk medicine thrived in the shadows. Its practitioners were not formally trained. They didn't wear robes or quote ancient texts. They carried baskets, walked the hedgerows, and whispered to plants. They were midwives, cunning women, root diggers, sometimes respected, often feared, and always useful to someone with a toothache, a difficult birth, or an unwanted pregnancy. Their tools were jars of dried leaves, bundles of bitter roots, and pots of ointment that smelled of moldy soap and salvation. Among their favorites were mandrake, henbane, belladonna, and nightshade, all beautiful, all toxic, all part of the same deadly botanical family. In the right hands, they were surprisingly effective. This is where the flying began. The so-called witch's ointment was not used to fly in the physical sense. But for the women who used it, something very real happened. The ointment, a blend of these potent herbs in a fat base, was applied where the skin was thin and receptive, the thighs, the underarms. Within minutes, the world shifted. The body grew weightless, sound distorted, thought untethered. And then the visions arrived. Some saw landscapes that did not exist, forests that glowed, meadows full of whispering teeth. Others experienced transformation into animals or smoke. Many described attending strange gatherings, Sabbaths with demons, familiars, and uninvited saints. There was food that was sometimes bones, music that often howled. The sensation of flight was common, the feeling of being pulled through walls and rooftops, of covering great distances without moving. These were not lies or theatrical hallucinations. They were immersive, embodied, and unforgettable experiences. From the user's perspective, she did float through the rafters. The ointments worked not gently, not safely, but they worked. The recipes were imprecise, measured by sight or instinct. One batch might induce a dream, another might induce convulsions. The risk was assumed. These mixtures were quietly passed down between women, often with caution and a short prayer. Lonely women used them, widows, midwives, isolated figures on the edge of town. Some used them for relief from pain or grief, others for insight, a few, perhaps, for company. The hallucinations might be terrifying, but at least they arrived. At least they spoke. The church, of course, was deeply unamused. When these women were accused of witchcraft, as many eventually were, their vivid descriptions of flight and nocturnal feasting were seized as proof of heresy and consorting with the devil. No one considered pharmacology. They considered only sin. Confessions were extracted, often with the help of fire and sharp metal. The women, speaking honestly about what they had experienced, were punished for it. The irony was thick enough to spread on toast underneath the myth. And the coerced confessions was a thread of pharmacological truth. These women were using real plants with real psychoactive effects. They were not summoning demons. They were accidentally recreating the conditions of a shamanic rite. Not all of them survived their own recipes. Some fell into a sleep from which they never woke. Others woke up confused, half naked in a ditch, still convinced they had been dancing with wolves. Some became legends. Most became cautionary tales. When asked later if they really flew, they said yes, without hesitation. And in a way that matters, perhaps they did, across the world. In the medieval Islamic world, the pursuit of altered states occupied a complicated space between crime, contemplation, and casual recreation. At one end of the spectrum were the mystics, at the other were bored bureaucrats and poets. The substance that connected them was hashish, made from compressed cannabis resin. Hashish was smoked, eaten, or otherwise consumed by anyone willing to drift sideways from consensus reality. It was not universally approved, but it was not rare. By the Islamic Golden Age, it had rooted itself in the cultural landscape, from the poetry salons of Baghdad to the back alleys of Cairo. It was a social condiment. Add a little, and the world felt gentler. Add a lot, and the world began to rearrange itself. Among Sufis who specialized in chasing the divine through movement, breath, and verse, hashish was less a scandal and more a possibility. Some treated it as a tool to quiet the self, a key to loosen the soul. A few called it a mirror fitting, as it reflected exactly what the user wasn't expecting to see. For poets, the relationship was even less ambiguous. Hashish was both muse and metaphor. The best verses arrived somewhere between dusk and complete mental disintegration. In garden courtyards and low-lit chambers, poetry was composed while laughter bubbled and someone stared a little too long at a decorative tile outside. These circles, hashish was divisive. Some Islamic jurists argued that any intoxicant was religiously forbidden. Others pointed out that the Quran specifically prohibited wine, not necessarily everything else that made people misplace their sandals. The legal debate stretched on. For centuries, rulers took inconsistent stances. One sultan would ban it and order public floggings. His nephew, inheriting the throne, would quietly reopen the cafes and have a pipe installed behind the library. Cannabis clubs appeared. In cities like Cairo and Damascus, these were not dens of debauchery, but relaxed, often quiet spaces where men gathered to recline, converse, and forget about tax assessments. The atmosphere was reverent. It was about softening the edges of consciousness. The hashish was often eaten, folded into pastries, or mixed with syrup. Conversations would drift. Ideas bloomed and wilted. Among wandering mystics and dervishes, hashish blended with whirling dances and rhythmic chants. A dancer might describe touching the edge of heaven during a turn. A singer might lose all sense of time. The Sufi path was already one of ego dissolution. For some, hashish was a particularly cooperative travel companion. Of course, its use wasn't always mystical. Soldiers chewed it to quiet their nerves. Clerks used it to endure long days of copying records no one would read. It became, in some places, the working man's meditation, available, affordable, and less fatal than wine. Critics claimed it led to laziness and moral collapse. Supporters pointed to the moral collapses occurring among those who didn't use it. The debate was circular. In literature, the hashish user became a stock figure, a dreamy philosopher, a harmless fool, a holy madman. Over time, attitudes hardened. New rulers sought order and control. The haze of the old cafes thinned. Public use declined. But hashish did not disappear. It persisted in whispered poems, in hidden gardens, in the long pauses between sentences. A pipe passed hand to hand, a slow exhale, a moment of quiet in a world that rarely allowed it. Hashish did not spark revolutions. It simply rearranged the furniture inside one's head. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes that was everything. If hashish was the philosopher's, smoke Opium was the physician's balm, and like most medieval medicine, it walked a narrow line between miracle and mistake. Though it made you care far less about which side of that line you were on. Cultivated since antiquity, opium had entrenched itself in the medical cabinets of both the Islamic and Christian worlds by the 9th and 10th centuries. Its appeal was simple: pain hurt, and opium stopped it. Physicians from Baghdad to Constantinople recorded recipes for powdered poppy seeds, black resin paste, and sleep syrups thickened with honey. In an era where amputation was commonplace and dental work involved prayer and pliers, opium was a revelation. It dulled the agony. It sometimes stopped the screaming. It came in many forms. There was poppy milk, a chalky tonic popular among monks and new mothers. There were teas and infusions for nervous disorders. There were syrups made with saffron and sugar, served too noble children too delicate for reality. And there was theriac, a legendary blend of over 60 ingredients, including just enough opium to make you forget how expensive it was. It was technically a cruel. Realistically, it was an elite way to be gently unconscious. The poor, improvised, crushed poppy mixed with cheap wine created a concoction that was equal parts sedative and stomach-turner. Doctors prescribed opium for nearly everything: insomnia, melancholy, gout, consumption, heartbreak. It didn't matter. If the patient was in pain or sufficiently annoying, opium found its way into the prescription. Clergy used it discreetly. Scholars used it to make the metaphysics of Aristotle slightly less intolerable. Surgeons packed wounds with opium paste, hoping the patient would survive long enough to send payment. Royalty had access to the finest varieties. A sultan might ingest so much before an audience that he nodded off mid-blessing and had to be nudged awake with a fan. In monasteries, the line between medicine and spiritual preparation blurred. A monk preparing too fast might take a dose to steal the flesh. A nun with stomach pains might be given syrup to prevent her from disturbing vespers with groaning. Opium had its place in prayer, too, not officially, but it helped with silence, stillness, and suffering. A monk could spend hours in contemplation, unmoved, barely breathing, his lips parting in what might have been prayer or the aftertaste of syrup. Side effects were acknowledged politely, then ignored: constipation, apathy, confusion, sudden death. These were framed as unfortunate coincidences or evidence of the patient's weak constitution. Nobody blamed the syrup. The screaming had stopped. The patient was smiling. Wasn't that what medicine was for? Addiction was poorly understood, or not taken seriously until the supplies ran out. A bishop's secretary might develop a fondness for the night tonic. A noblewoman might grow dependent on her pain powder. The problem only became apparent when a favored servant dropped dead, with black resin crusted on their teeth. Doctors responded by trying to neutralize opium's effects with lead, amber, or crushed emerald. None of it worked, but it gave the impression of intervention. The more devout questioned whether relief was a sin. Was pain a gift? Did numbness offend the divine? Most answered quietly with another dose. The body was a temple, but it was also a sack of suffering. Temples, like people, sometimes needed reinforcement. In the Islamic world, opium was respected and feared. Physicians recorded its uses with precision, noting dosages and fatal limits. It was included in formal pharmacopoeias. as both a cure and a danger. Its knowledge spread west through trade and the Crusaders, who returned with strange powders and stranger habits. European apothecaries scrambled to imitate Eastern formulas. Most got it wrong. A few got it far to right by the later Middle Ages. Opium was a staple in city hospitals, sitting alongside leeches and jars of unidentified fluid. Patients often asked for it by name, and yet it remained poorly understood. No one knew how much was too much until it was too late. A monk might drift into eternal rest mid-prayer. A soldier might slur his wedding vows and forget he was married. People died quietly, usually with a faint smile and a serenity that seemed almost holy until someone tried to wake them. No one blamed the poppy. They never did. Not all intoxication came from barrels or grinding herbs. Sometimes it came from bees, small, industrious creatures that wandered into the wrong flowers. In the forests around the Black Sea, bees pollinated rhododendrons. The flowers were beautiful, but the nectar was not. It contained a neurotoxin called granotoxin. The bees, unaware, collected it and produced what locals called mad honey. Its effects were never subtle. A spoonful might induce numbness, slowed heartbeat, sweating, vertigo, and vivid hallucinations. 2 spoonfuls might send you into a convulsing sleep from which you might not wake. And yet, for centuries, people sought it out deliberately. Local healers used it in small amounts to treat hypertension. Mystics used it to break open the doors of perception. Warriors used it more creatively. One of the earliest recorded uses of mad day honey as a weapon comes from 67 BCE, the Roman general Pompey. Forces were advancing through the region when they encountered honeycombs left behind by the local Heptacomet's tribe. The Romans, hungry and unaware, ate freely. Within hours, they were writhing on the ground, vomiting, their senses broken and limbs useless. The locals returned and massacred them with ease. It remains one of the stickiest defeats in military history. Outside of warfare, the honey found its way into homes by mistake. A curious monk might sample a local jar and spend the next 6 hours weeping at the foot of a statue he believed was speaking. A noblewoman might collapse mid-dance, clutching her chest as the walls melted around her. These incidents were blamed on demons, curses, or intense spiritual experiences. The bees remained above suspicion. Sometimes the honey was fermented into mead, which didn't neutralize the toxin, but gave it a smoother delivery system. Drinkers reported dreams that lasted for days, and visitations from saints or serpents. For some, this was enlightenment. For others, it was a brush with death, served in a wooden cup. In isolated communities, the honey's effects became folklore. People told stories of men who saw angels in the trees or women who spoke in tongues. Some claimed consuming it during specific moon phases granted prophetic powers. Others simply used it to forget. In regions where famine and war were constant, forgetting was sometimes the most sacred act of all. Yet for every visionary, there were those who reacted badly. A child might stumble after a bite and never walk properly again. A farmer might collapse rigid in his fields. The line between ecstasy and agony was as thin as a bee's wing. Authorities occasionally intervened. Rulers banned the sale of certain honeys. Apothecaries were warned. Monasteries issued polite warnings in their herbal manuals. Still, the honey persisted. It was too useful, too mysterious, too compelling to abandon entirely. Sufi. Mystics sometimes experimented with it during fasts or trances, claiming it stripped away illusion and dissolved the ego. Whether it brought wisdom or just cardiovascular distress is hard to determine from a prone position. In some cases, mad honey became a form of resistance. When all other tools were denied, the people still had bees. A little nectar hidden in a jar could topple a tax collector or humble an occupying soldier. It was messy and unreliable, but it worked just often enough to inspire stories whispered around fires. As both warnings and promises, modern researchers have since isolated the compounds. They've written papers and created dosage guidelines. But in the medieval world, such precision didn't exist. All they knew was that some honey healed and some honey turned your blood to fire. They kept eating it anyway. Curiosity, desperation, and a morbid tolerance for risk carried most decisions. It didn't help that the honey looked beautiful, thick, golden red, almost glowing. It tasted like something slightly forbidden. The medieval world was full of smoke, not just from hearths and forges, but the kind people deliberately inhaled for reasons ranging from medicinal to devotional. If something could be set on fire, steeped, or crumbled into a pouch, someone claimed it calmed the nerves, softened labor pains, or opened a portal to divine truth. Sometimes it even did. Herbs like henbane, yarrow, mugwort, and wormwood were dried, crushed, and burned. They were added to herbal pillows, sewn into sachets for anxious monks, or steeped in bowls to release pungent vapors. A sick room might be fumigated with them, so might a chapel. It was hard to say if anyone felt better, but the room certainly smelled different. In childbirth, smoke was used to drive out bad spirits, or, failing that, to drown out the screaming. Midwives passed herbs over coals and waved the smoke with solemn gestures. The effect was half spiritual, half pharmaceutical. If it worked, it was the grace of God. If it didn't, it was the devil in the mother. Then there was the incense. Frankincense and myrrh were not just symbolic, they were daily fare for medieval churches, and both contain mild psychoactive compounds when burned. Nothing dramatic, but enough to lower blood pressure and make prolonged chanting feel more cosmic. Step into a thickly smoked cathedral, and you might genuinely believe in angels. Step out, and the fresh air might feel vaguely heretical. This was not accidental. Incense helped people feel reverent. It softened the edges of long sermons and added an otherworldly filter to worldly problems. Priests swung censers not just to sanctify the space, but to medicate it. Beyond the altar, herbal mixtures made their way into daily life. Herbal pillows stuffed with lavender or hops were used by the wealthy to encourage sleep. For the poor, a few wilted leaves in a rag had to suffice. The idea was the same. Breathe deep, shut your eyes, and hope the night passes without a coughing fit. Of course, not everything was restful. Henbane, when smoked, had a reputation for inducing visions and vomiting, often in quick succession. It was used for toothaches, gout, and despair. Yarrow was a catchel chewed, brewed, burned, or bathed in, depending on the need. It might slow bleeding, calm nerves, or encourage prophetic dreams. More importantly, it made the healer look busy. A room full of steam, chance, and sharp smells often accomplished more than a single accurate diagnosis. In plague years, this practice intensified. People carried posies of fragrant herbs, lavender, sage, pennyroyal too, hold beneath their noses against the stench of death and decay. Physicians stuffed their beaked masks with these herbs. It was a desperate defense against invisible death. It's easy to dismiss these as primitive traditions, but the line between religious ritual and rudimentary pharmacology was thin. A priest burning frankincense believed it sanctified the air. A midwife steaming yarrow believed it summoned strength. Occasionally, both were right, at least in the sense that it made people feel less helpless, which, in medieval medicine, was often the only treatment available. Some herbalists believed smoke could drive out madness. Others believed it could draw it in. In one account, a woman was healed of demonic possession after inhaling the smoke of an herblaced fire on a damp church floor. Her family called it a miracle. The herbalist said it was wormwood. The church canonized no one, but kept the recipe just in case. These treatments were not always voluntary. Children were forced to inhale Herbal smoke for fevers. The experience stung the eyes and burned the throat, leaving many more afraid of the cure than the illness. Still, some recovered, or at least stopped convulsing long enough to be declared healed. The same treatments were given to the elderly, the melancholic, the epileptic. A neighbor who screamed at the moon might be blessed with steam and prayer, until he quieted. If nothing worked, there was always confession. Or fire. Cultural memory is short, but the smell of certain herbs lingers. Many of these plants still appear in modern gardens, though few would dare burn them indoors now. They are botanical fossils, reminders of a time when survival depended not on understanding the body, but on doing something to convince it to behave. For all its chaos, medieval folk medicine had its patterns. The poor sniffed plants and prayed. The clergy burned resins and prayed. The wealthy hired people to do both, and then blamed the devil when it failed. Everyone agreed the soul needed tending, but they differed wildly on what that meant for the lungs. Dosage was always a guess. A little resin might bring calm. A little more might bring visions. Too much, and the only thing ascending was the patient. Smoke blurred the boundaries between medicine and mysticism, between prayer and panic. By the time the Renaissance began, many of these rituals faded or were repackaged as quaint curiosities. Some were banned, others were absorbed into traditions that no longer remembered why they began, only that they were comforting. The world moved forward, with a little less smoke in its lungs and just as much confusion in its heart, in a world where the sky was thick with theology and the ground slick with superstition. Not all visions came from moldy bread or questionable ointments. Some were said to come straight from heaven, or from someone who claimed to be on speaking terms with it. The boundaries between intoxication, illness, and divine inspiration blurred like wet ink on parchment. Miracles could begin with a fever and end with canonization, or more often, with a quiet burial and an uncomfortable silence. The saints were the original celebrities of medieval Europe, revered for their piety and their complete detachment from physical reality. You could see angels in the rafters, or hear the voice of Christ from a soup bowl. The key was not whether it made sense, but whether anyone else believed it. Take Catherine of Siena, famed for her mystical visions and ecstatic trances. She spent much of her life in a state that by modern standards would require several specialists. But Catherine didn't need pills. She had fasting, exhaustion, and faith. Her visions arrived during intense deprivation weeks without food, hours of prayer, self-inflicted discomfort designed to make the mortal coil unbearable enough for the soul to wriggle free. It was not uncommon. Starvation was a prerequisite for holiness. The closer one got to wasting away, the closer one was to the divine. For female mystics, this was proof of purity. For male clerics, it was strength of mind. Either way, the results were predictable: hallucinations, catatonia, religious ecstasy, and sometimes accidental sainthood. No one asked if you'd simply been dizzy. The chemical aids to holiness were not always accidental. Holy oils used to anoint the sick or the dying were sometimes enhanced with herbs known to produce warming or euphoric effects. Poppy oil lent a blissful serenity. Frankincense, burned in small, airless crypts, was almost guaranteed to produce at least one vision per session, especially if you were already fragile. For those who weren't saints but simply unwell, the same substances were less inspiring. The line between miracle and madness was paper-thin. A prophet might rise from a sickbed with a divine message, or they might claw at the walls and scream about demons. The difference often was whether your visions comforted those in charge. Some claimed the martyrs were granted numbing grace at the moment of death, that they did not feel the flames or the rack. In hagiographies, they smile through crucifixion and sing hymns as lions approach. Whether this was divine anesthesia or poppy extract is up for debate, but miracle made for a better story. Monasteries and convents became breeding grounds for altered states. Long hours of fasting, silent prayer, and repetitive chanting created an atmosphere ripe for mental detachment. Monks swayed mid-chant from dehydration and caloric deficit. In winter, small fires mixed with incense in poorly ventilated chapels, and visions arrived in curls of smoke. They might have been divine, or they might have been carbon monoxide. It wasn't all accident. Some mystics actively pursued these states. Anchorites, who walled themselves into small cells, reported visions after days of fever and agony. Some embraced self-flagellation, whipping themselves into an altered state. Others stared at the same icon for so long that it began to blink back. The Church's attitude was inconsistent. A nun who saw the Virgin Mary might be blessed, interrogated, or quietly transferred. If she documented her visions with poetic clarity, she might be a mystic. If she screamed about serpents, she might be labeled possessed. Both outcomes involved incense. Outside the cloister, the same symptoms led to different results. Villagers who fell into ecstatic trances were less likely to be canonized and more likely to be chained. Those who claimed divine communication without sufficient pedigree were accused of heresy. It was one thing to see angels, it was another to say what they told you, especially if it contradicted the bishop's sermon. And yet, medieval Europe was strangely tolerant of these states if they were framed correctly. Pain could be divine, suffering could be holy, madness could be mystical. The body was a vessel, the world a trial. If someone fell into a euphoric trance in the middle of Mass, perhaps the Holy Spirit had taken an interest. Stories of Eastern mystics floating in meditation filtered westward, reinforcing The idea that spiritual greatness and altered perception went hand in hand. The methods differed, but the outcomes were familiar. Enlightenment, revelation, occasional drooling. In the end, there was a peculiar equality to the medieval vision. A feverish child might glimpse heaven. A starving nun might hear voices. A monk surrounded by incense might weep with joy. No one questioned the source, only the message. If the vision reinforced faith, it was divine. If it contradicted the bishop, it was madness. If it predicted good fortune, it was a miracle. If it smelled of sulfur, it was a demon. But in every case, the vision mattered more than the vessel. The vessel, of course, could always be replaced. Not everyone chose their path to altered consciousness. The line between medicine, poison, and potion was as blurry as a monk's handwriting after his third pint. There were no warning labels, no dosage charts. Remedies were passed down through whispers or scribbled in margins. If something quieted the baby, it was good. If it made the goat lie down and stop screaming, even better. Survival, not science, was the principle. If a few souls collapsed into the mud along the way, that was simply part of the learning curve. Infants were not exempt. A wailing child was an urgent problem, and the solution was often a sleep draught, a mixture of poppy syrup, anise, seed, honey, and wine. The intent wasn't malicious, it was compassionate. A baby that slept did not cry. A mother who slept might live another day. A village that slept didn't go mad. But the trouble with homemade potions is that they rarely came with instructions. A drop might be a spoonful. A pinch might be half the bag. Children drifted into drugged slumber. Some woke up dazed and groggy. Others didn't wake up at all. Their deaths were mourned, but rarely questioned. God had taken them earlier, merciful overdose, wrapped in theological gauze. Animals, too, wandered into altered states, though through curiosity rather than design. Goats are poor judges of what not to eat. They sampled moldy roots, bitter leaves, and psychoactive fungi. A goat with wide eyes and unsteady legs was not an uncommon sight. Villagers might laugh. A few might make note of which bush caused it, just in case. Swine were worse. Pigs given access to fallen fruit would gorge themselves into an alcoholic stupor. Entire herds could be found sprawled across orchard floors, twitching and grunting, as the trees spun above them. For a poor family relying on that pig, it was inconvenient. For the pig, it was probably enlightening until the hangover cats had their own interests, often involving catmint or valerian, which produced effects not unlike mild narcotics. People noticed but attributed it to natural magic. The cat was gifted, or touched full of mystery, as cats have always insisted. The crossover between human and animal remedies went both ways. In villages without apothecaries, the same mixtures were given to both livestock and people. A tea that calmed a colicky baby might be poured into a trough for a nervous cow. A salve for a broken bone might be rubbed into a sheep's injured flank. There was little separation between veterinary and human medicine. If it grew and seemed to help, it was used. The results were inconsistent. A sick child might be given a strong herbal wine once used on an ox. A dying horse might receive a poultice meant for menstrual cramps. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Sometimes it did something entirely unexpected. But in a world where divine intervention was as plausible as chemical reaction. Failures were blamed on fate or demons. Children, like animals, were prone to accidental ingestion. A toddler might chew a bitter leaf in the garden. A curious child might sip the dregs of a monk's flask. Some ate henbane berries because they looked like candy. The resulting symptoms, vomiting, trembling, hallucinations, were sometimes interpreted as demonic possession, leading to prayers, exorcism, and leeches. Rarely did anyone say, "Perhaps he shouldn't have eaten that." There were cases where intoxicated animals led to intoxicated people. A goat that kept licking a certain patch of bark might be watched. Eventually, a bold villager would try a bit himself. If he began swaying or babbling, the bark might be declared interesting. Dogs were sometimes used as test subjects. If a dog survived a remedy, it might be tried on a human. If the dog died or ran in terrified circles, the plant was avoided until someone forgot why. The problem was not malice, but ignorance. The medieval world was not full of cruel fools, but of desperate improvisers, without understanding chemistry. Trial and error was the only method. The herbs that dulled pain could erase memory. The teas that soothed the stomach could stop the heart. A bit too much poppy milk, and a restless child became a still one. These were tragedies, but they were shrugged off with a weary fatalism born from centuries of bad luck. Even in monasteries or manor houses, children and animals were victims of poorly understood substances. An abbey might grow mandrake for ritual purposes, but not keep it from novices. A nobleman's hunting dogs might lap up his gout, tonic, and howl at invisible deer. It was the price of experimentation, and so the medieval world carried on, dosing its infants with sleepy herbs, letting its pigs stumble through orchards, and watching as goats chewed on things that made their eyes go wide. There were no disclaimers, no poison control centers. There was only village gossip, the herbalist's shrug, and the occasional grave dug a little too small. Some accidents came from bottles or bark. Others came from the simple act of being alive. Because when the air stank of death and everything you touched was rotting, even sobriety started to feel like a fever dream. By the time one reached the streets of a medieval town, the senses had already begun to surrender. There was no gentle acclamation. You stepped outside and were overwhelmed. The scent hit first, a thick, clawing blend of open sewage, rotting meat, animal waste, smoke, and the oily sweat of unwashed bodies. Then the visuals, crooked buildings leaning inward, streets a lumpy mess of mud and dung. Finally, the sounds, shouting vendors, clattering hooves, clanging bells, and always a baby wailing or a dog barking at nothing. It was an environment calibrated to obliterate modern sensory endurance. People lived above their animals. Garbage was thrown into the street. Rain didn't clean. It stirred the filth into cellars and water barrels. Even in rural areas, the smells of decay were close. Dead livestock, damp straw, unwashed bodies in a single room. The medieval diet didn't help. Bread might be moldy, ale might be sour, meat, if you could afford it, was often halfway to rancid. Cheese could be aggressively alive. Digestive discomfort was a constant companion. Then there was the matter of light. Once the sun set, the world slipped into an amber half-existence. Illumination came from fire hearths, candles, oil lamps. These cast dancing shadows, turning familiar walls into uncertain terrain. A pile of clothes became a crouching figure. A cat's movement prompted a scream. Night was not restful. It was a playground for the imagination. Sleep produced not peaceful dreams, but vivid excursions through anxiety, fever, and spiritual dread. People dreamed of fire, flood, demons, and death. Many believed these visions were omens or warnings. The mind, already frayed by diet and disease, offered little defense. The body was a disaster. Most lived with chronic ailments, toothaches, joint pain, festering wounds, infections that never truly healed. Hygiene was inconsistent. Soap was a luxury. People itched, coughed, bled, and limped through life. Disease was the great constant. Fleas, lice, and parasites were nearly universal. Plague, leprosy, and pax stalked the land. Every illness came with its own symptoms: fever, delirium, visions. No one understood infection. Miasma theory, that disease came from bad air, dominated, and in a world where the air always smelled bad, everyone felt under constant threat. In times of fever, hallucinations were expected. A child might speak in tongues. A dying man might see angels. A woman in childbirth might claim she'd flown across the rafters. No one doubted the experiences. They were either divine or demonic. Even spiritual experiences were filtered through physical discomfort. Fasting didn't just bring purity. It brought dizziness and vivid hallucinations. Monks who starved themselves for devotion often reported divine encounters. Modern understanding suggests they were also dangerously malnourished and possibly high on incense. Still, no one asked. The vision was what mattered. Children grew up in this environment. They knew the smell of death before they understood the word. They saw animals slaughtered and relatives die. They heard sermons filled with fire and torment. Their minds formed in a world where hallucination was not exceptional. It was background noise, and the noise never stopped. Between the tolling bells, the crying of the sick, and the clamor of human misery, the medieval soundscape was a relentless percussion of stress. Quiet was rare. Reflection required peace, and there was little to be found. Even monasteries were not immune to outbreaks of mass hysteria or strange visions. It was as though the entire era was trapped on the edge of something, a cliff of reason, beyond which lay either revelation or collapse. There were those who claimed to embrace it: seers, saints, mystics, and madmen. Some inspired awe. Others were beaten in the streets. All bore witness to the same truth, that in a world so disordered, so overwhelmed by scent, sound, hunger, illness, and fear, the mind was never wholly secure. It drifted, it cracked, it danced with shadows, and sometimes it surrendered entirely. People survived anyway. They farmed, they sang, they laughed sometimes, but the foundation was always shifting. No matter how strong one's faith, or how sturdy one's walls, the rot was never far. It seeped into the lungs, the skin, the bread, the brain, until even the most rational man found himself staring into the firelight, unsure if the shape in the corner was real or just a trick of heat and memory. To be medieval was to be overwhelmed. The body failed often, the soul more often still. And so people reached not upward, not inward, but outward, toward the nearest leaf, root, flask, vision, or whisper that promised, however briefly, to make the world feel like less of a punishment. What were they looking for? The question feels modern. This was not self-exploration. It was survival with a hallucinogenic edge. Some wanted to feel closer to the divine. Others just wanted to stop coughing. Some sought prophecy. Others wanted to pass out before childbirth. But underneath it all was a single, universal hope. That there might be a moment of relief somewhere in the chaos. They did not call it trauma, they called it life. And if that life required a few spoonfuls of poppy milk to face a sick child's screams, so be it. If it took fermented honey to dull the sound of a neighbor's death rattle, then pass the cup. If the saints only spoke when your head was splitting, then that was the price of revelation. The medieval mind did not seek intoxication as rebellion. It sought it as ritual, as medicine, as prayer, with fewer rules and better results. Sometimes it worked. A difficult birth was eased. A wound was dulled. A mourner was calmed. More often, it didn't. There were spasms, infections, blindness, death. But the line between miracle and misfortune was rarely visible in the moment, and so the salves kept being made, the mushrooms kept being dried, the honey kept being harvested, because what else was there? You couldn't ask for better gods. You could only reach for different plants. These weren't parties. There was no laughter echoing across plague carts. Even the drunkest feast felt like obligation. No one danced for joy. They danced because they hadn't died that day. These were coping mechanisms, fermented, ground, and smeared beneath the tongue by trembling hands. Sometimes it helped. Sometimes it brought visions. Sometimes those visions got you canonized. Sometimes they got you arrested. The outcome depended on gender, geography, and whether the bishop was having a bad week. But even then, the hallucinations were not questioned only the person having them. A nobleman's ecstatic dream was divine. A peasant woman's was probably witchcraft. Both were valid, so long as someone wrote them down. There is a temptation to call it all foolish, to smile at the idea of flying ointment, or dismiss incense-fogged cathedrals as quaint delusion. But what has really changed? The roots have chemical names now, but the hunger is the same, the quiet hope that something might dull the ache, lift the veil, offer a glimpse of something better even if it's a hallucinated goat in a bishop's hat. Medieval medicine was controlled guessing. Some herbs calmed nerves, others caused visions. The point wasn't perfection, it was participation, a shared, stumbling attempt to reach beyond the daily drudge of filth and theology. To call it drug use is to miss the point. It was never about escape. It was about proximity to God, to peace, to numbness, sometimes all at once. There were no safety labels, just a slurry of bark and alcohol, a sniff of something sharp, a prayer that the screaming might stop, that you might sleep, that you might wake up not feeling like your bones were made of splinters. Even the church had to make room for the inexplicable, for the visions of saints that looked like fever dreams, for the oil that calmed more than it blessed. In time, they codified the miracles and sanitized the martyrs, but the roots were still under the floorboards. The monks still drank their liquid bread with alarming enthusiasm. It is tempting to call it tragic, and it was. Children drugged into silence. Women branded as witches for the same ointments that once saved lives. Men hallucinating demons where there were none. But it was also, in its own twisted, root-bound way, beautiful, a kind of stubborn poetry that insisted life might hold more than plague and poverty and pain, that maybe the world could shimmer for a moment with something else. And if that shimmer came from fermented fruits, or burning resin, or a damp mushroom eaten in the dark, so be it. The outcome was often the same. Someone sitting in a corner, eyes wide, murmuring to themselves, or curled under a blanket, heart slowed, breathing even, or simply absent, gone beyond the veil, and never quite returning the same. But they had gone, and that was the point. Because what they were really chasing wasn't madness or ecstasy or even healing. They were chasing meaning in the smell of a flower, in the murmur of a fever, in the taste of something bitter and old and sacred. They reached through the rot and the sermons and the dirt for something, anything that might explain why the world felt like it did, why the pain never ended, why the sky didn't answer. Maybe they found God, maybe they found nothing, maybe they just passed out and woke up worse, but they kept looking over centuries, in kitchens and convents and caves, through scrolls and secrets and smoked glass. They kept looking because to be human is to hope that something just beyond the edge of understanding might still be waiting, merciful, or at least mildly anesthetic. And really, what's a little blindness if it meant you laughed once that year? That brings us to the end of tonight's story, not of heroes or revolutions, but of 1,000 forgotten souls, sniffing herbs, sipping syrups, and rubbing questionable ointments on increasingly questionable places, all in the hope of touching something like peace.